New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in many of the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Good evening. Our topic tonight is the practical application of psychic abilities, and my guest, Keith Harary, is a parapsychologist, psychologist, and psychic practitioner, and also the co-author of a remarkable book called The Mind Race. Welcome, Keith.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You combine within yourself a very unique background as both a researcher and a practitioner of psychic abilities, a person who's really balancing both the objective and the subjective aspects of this field at a rather high level. In your book, The Mind Race, you describe numerous experiments in remote viewing that were conducted at SRI International, a big military industrial think tank, and under auspices of the U.S. government financing. Can you tell me a little bit how you got started in remote viewing?
I was very interested in the possibility that people could have a psychic experience at will without going into some strange state of mind, some isolation tank, or some heavy experimental procedure.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that a person can just sit down, quiet their thoughts, and describe, for example, someplace thousands of miles away and accurately tell what is happening there, even though they have no idea at the time what the place is that they're being asked to describe. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can do that without special kinds of equipment, or we used to lock people in isolation chambers. The fact you don't have to do that.
Or no meditative disciplines or other preparation.
Nothing. What it involves is telling the difference between what I call mental noise and psychic information. Mental noise is analysis, free association, guessing, past memories, the information around you and your environment, all the things that tend to confuse you when you're trying to clear your mind and just get a psychic impression.
Mm-hmm. So as a result of your interest, you began working as a researcher and as a practitioner at SRI.
Well, the nice thing about doing something like remote viewing is that it doesn't involve some belief system. So if you're going to do the remote viewing yourself, it doesn't mean that you totally lose your objectivity. It means that it's as though, do you lose objectivity when you play the piano? Well, no, you learn something else about that than you would if you just sit in the audience.
You know, you're saying this, I suppose, because many people would imagine that a person who practices psychic abilities like remote viewing would be some type of a mystic or an astrologer.
I'm not. I'm
a
sorry.
Sufi, a theosophist, a Scientologist. You're none of those.
I'm none of those things, I'm afraid. And in fact, the exciting thing is that ordinary, everyday people, not following any particular belief system, having their own belief systems, having their own way of life, whatever it is, keeping that, can learn to, with practice, improve their psychic abilities. And I'm afraid that I don't have the answer to how the world is put together. On the other hand, under very carefully controlled conditions, we can show people how to do things that they never knew they could do before.
And the basic element, I gather, is the self-concept, that you can do this, the willingness to allow yourself to do it.
That's part of it, but really what's important is learning the skills involved. It turns out that psychic functioning is not a matter of heavy-duty belief. It's not a matter of going into an altered state. It's a matter of paying attention. And if you learn to pay attention in a certain way, if you learn to recognize certain kinds of impressions and what the right ones are and what the wrong ones are, and that's a mental skill. And you learn, first of all, you have to recognize what you're feeling. Then you have to learn to communicate that in a way that doesn't turn it into some other thing. For example, if I said to you, Jeff, I've got a box here with an object hidden in it. Right away, you're going to look at the box and you're going to try to size up what's in it. how big is it? How heavy does it seem?
The intellect gets in the way.
That's right. That's
the
analysis.
First step.
Right. Then, even if you clear that out, you may have favorite objects at home or things that you've fiddled with today, and that kind of creeps up in your mind when you start thinking about objects. So that's a memory overlay.
Yeah.
Or you look around the room and you see objects in the room and they kind of impede on your mind. You kind of say, oh, wait a minute. I see that they kind of intrude. And you get these images from the room around you that have nothing to do with what's in the box. If you clear out the analysis, the memory, the noise, or even what I call free association in this case.
5 or 6 levels of
That's
mental overlays, and underneath all of that one might find a psychic signal.
Yes, and the psychic signal doesn't come off perfectly clearly either. It doesn't say, oh, there's a coffee cup sitting in this box. No, you might get a curve in the coffee cup, and what I was talking about the free association is you will tend to turn that curve into something else. Oh, a curve reminds me of a playground ball. Then you start describing that. If you can get away from that and go back to your original impression, keep going back to your original impression, keep looking at the new impressions that come up in a surprising kind of way, it turns out that you can learn to do this. It is not easy. I won't say to you, just go with the flow and sit down and, and just go with the vibes and let it happen. You have to pay attention, and you have to pay attention in a very concentrated way. But you don't have to go into a trance. And in fact, people have been wide awake and doing remote viewing and moving cars with lots and lots of noise around them, but still clearly focusing in their own mind on what's happening, to the point where they can even draw pictures of what's coming up.
And once, after a great deal of practice, you learn to pay attention and to do this skill with a great deal of accuracy as you have, even then it can slip away from time to time, I gather.
Well, you're dealing with a human being. Think about the Harlem Globetrotters playing basketball. I mean, they're really amazing. Nobody would doubt they play basketball. Now, I'm sure they miss the hoop occasionally, because that's part of being human. You're going to miss occasionally. You have your own sort of doubts. Maybe you didn't sleep that morning. Maybe you had a confusing day, or maybe there's just something particularly confusing about this situation. And that's okay. If people feel that they're being tested, am I psychic or am I not? This is it, I'm on the line. That's not a good situation. But we don't have a test to find out if a person is psychic or not psychic. What we have is a learnable skill, which it looks like most people can learn to use. And that's really surprising. We used to look for special people who had special abilities. And there's no doubt that there are certain people who are really good at this. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the population has no ability at all.
Well, you've been working in the laboratory, studying this phenomenon subjectively, objectively, for probably about 15 years or more at this point. When did you begin to become interested in the practical applications?
Well, I had been in the laboratory doing work, as you said, and what I found was we were getting spectacular results. For example, we had a woman in Moscow who described on a particular day where I would be 4 hours in her future. Now, in San Francisco. She was in Moscow, I was in San Francisco. We were 10,000 miles apart, and she was going to describe where I was 4 hours later. She said I would be at a cupola, curved building in a plaza with animal ears and animal eyes and sofa buttons. Turned out 4 hours later I was at the merry-go-round in Pier 39 in the plaza. And there was no way that she could have known that, because I didn't even know 4 hours before where I would be, and neither did anyone in the Soviet Union. Of course, that was all filmed by their Academy of Sciences. That kind of research was going on. I could give you dozens upon dozens of examples, and yet I was walking down the street and seeing films like Scanners, where they make very, very horrifying images of psychic abilities, and the public at large was not being reached by the research.
Very often the public is sort of being trained by the media to be afraid.
That's right. That's right. So how do you reach the public? Well,
let me pull you back a little bit, though. What are the practical applications
to
here?
reach the public, you have to show them that what you're looking at is relevant, that it matters, that it's not just some esoteric study.
In other words, what you're saying is your interest in practical applications was basically as a way of reaching out to people.
That's right. And, for example, I'm interested in using remote viewing to look for oil or to look for natural resources. This is a situation in which people can be very, very good at describing remote geographical locations. So, if a person can do that, can they tell you what's under the ground? That's a research question. It has definite applications. What we found was, and this is only in a preliminary study because you have to get oil companies involved and so forth, but a driller came to me and said, look, I'm drilling a well. Can you tell me what will be there? And I told him, there is orange mud around here, there's a peninsula, there is mountains over here, there's water over here. All that turned out to be correct. You're drilling here. There's no oil in that well. I'm sorry, there's only hot water. He said, oh, that's wonderful. I'm not drilling for oil, I'm drilling a thermal well, I'm drilling for hot water. I didn't tell you that. And he went and he drilled there and he hit the water.
And what was your impression? How did you know that?
Well, I knew that because I have a lot of experience in dealing with those kinds of images. It's not because I was doing some supernatural thing. For me, it's a matter of straightforward information processing. I've learned to pay attention to certain kinds of available information in my own mind and to recognize what that is. Now, I can't do this perfectly every time, and there's nothing that unusual about my doing it because dozens upon dozens of people have done it.
And how long did it take you to really develop this skill to a level where it had any reliability?
Well, it's hard to say with me because I've been working in this area for 16 years. But I have worked with people who have done very, very well in a weekend or in a week. Of course, people improve with practice and get more reliable.
Okay, very good. So what are some of the other practical areas that you've worked in, Keith?
I've worked in criminology. I'm working on murder cases, that kind of thing. I can't talk about that very much because, first of all, if there's someone out there who killed somebody and they think that you're psychically tuning in to them, you can imagine that they wouldn't be very happy about that. But often the police or the families involved don't want you to talk about it. I could say that there has been very good information provided that has been useful to the point where people have been described, have been involved, who fit certain suspects, and you can also point out where certain things might be looked for that might help with the case. Certain details, what was happening. Of course, people have been looking for bodies with psychic abilities for a long time. I didn't come up with that.
Well, I've, with my background in criminology, have looked into a number of these cases and found some with remarkable accuracy.
Yes, and let's face it, there are a lot of situations in which you just don't have enough information to go on. And why not use a reliable psychic?
Well, that's a good situation. I mean, if all the normal methods of solving a particular problem have been exhausted and nothing else is left, it would seem that there's very little to be lost by using psychically derived inputs, and perhaps a great deal to be gained.
You have to be careful, though, because the police get flooded with calls of people calling themselves psychics and saying, we've got the answer, and it's a wild goose chase all over wherever you want to look. But if you work with reliable people, with reliable techniques, and you cross-correlate what they say with one another, and then you can do a very scientific analysis of the information and save the police a lot of trouble. But it's one thing to work with the police, and of course if you're an expert in remote viewing, that's a good thing to do. It also makes sense to teach the police to use their own abilities. And there's no reason why they can't do that also.
Have you been involved in that?
Well, Pat Price was, in fact, the ex-police commissioner of Burbank, California.
We should add that he's one of the remote viewing subjects at SRI International.
He was. He's dead now, but he was one of the really outstanding remote viewers. And he claimed that he had used that all through his career to catch criminals. He would say, according to what he says, he would say, well, there's been a crime, somebody's out there hiding, let me look and see where I see a very scared person. And then he would go there and see if he could turn up something. Well, he must have done something because he certainly advanced in his career solving a lot of cases. Of course, it's hard to evaluate that kind of spontaneous report. But if you work in a controlled scientific way on a case, keeping all of the data and analyzing it, then you see some very, very good results, and that you can really talk about.
So basically you're suggesting a methodology where you get people who have been trained, are known to be reliable, and then a number of them, not just one, so that you can cross-correlate the information they give you, and I suppose so the burden doesn't fall on any one person to come up with all the information needed.
Not only that, a psychologist might focus on certain things about the people involved, but an engineer might focus on certain other details, or a photographer might focus on others. If you get an interdisciplinary team of remote viewers, they might come up with very, very different perspectives and help you put together a larger picture. So that's some of the practical applications. Missing children, downed airplanes. Of course, right now, we don't even begin to have the resources that we would need to begin to go after some of that. mean, I would like to spend a huge amount of time on missing children. I think it's really important. But of course, working with a very small number of people in an institute, it's very hard to have that amount of time and the resources and the funding you need to be able to just give that time to the families. I don't like to charge the families in that situation. On the other hand, you also have to do your work and keep your work going. So.
Well, given all of these constraints that exist on the field at this time, including the enormous social controversy, which doesn't really help, what do you think are the viable areas where we might see in the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years some breakthroughs in terms of applications of psychic ability?
It's already happening. The fact is that, first of all, people are starting to realize that using their own intuition is not a strange thing. So there are a lot of successful business people who are probably using it already and are either not aware of it or not talking about it. You say, well, will we start to use psychic abilities in the future? I think we're using them now.
And probably have been all along in that sense.
Probably have been all along.
I mean, you could say the oldest professions, the shamans of ancient cultures, were practicing the applied use of psi abilities.
And sometimes they were practicing a few other things besides. But
magic tricks.
Magic tricks, but
whatever they could use.
We also have the really down-to-earth practical applications in, for example, missing persons, missing airplanes, looking for natural resources.
Can you talk in general about financial markets?
Okay. You knew that I hadn't brought that up. Yes, I had done some remote viewing in the silver commodities market and managed to call 9 times in a row the magnitude and direction of changes in the December silver market.
Yes.
We made over $120,000 for a client. Client got very excited by that. It was an applied remote viewing technique that worked very well. The client then wanted more and more remote viewings, more and more often, no breaks in between, and I just said, forget it, because then it started not to work. So people tend to get very greedy around that sort of thing. You have to be very careful. You don't become the goose that laid the golden egg.
And do you think that greed gets in the way of the psychic functioning working well?
Yeah. The human beings are self-limiting. They impose their own limitations upon themselves more than having a lot of inherent limitations in some areas. Obviously we have limitations, but they're probably fewer than we think in this area. And what happens is that people start to get nervous, or they start to get self-conscious. They start to worry about what it means about who they are if they start to do well at something psychically, and that's when you see the thing falling apart.
Yeah. Let's talk for a moment, though, about the particular technique you used, associative remote viewing. I think it's nice because it gets around some of the problems that you mentioned earlier, such as the intellect getting in the way in a case like this.
Well, psychic ability is not an analytic process. As I said, analysis is a kind of mental noise. If I say to you, what will the market do on Tuesday? Let's say, will silver go up, down, or not change at all relative to Thursday? You say, well, how am I supposed to know that? Should I give you a number? Should I look in the paper? Should I try to figure it out?
Well, you begin to think of all the news you've heard.
All the news, what you'd like to happen. That's terrible. So you don't ask a person that. You say, I'm going to hand you an object on Monday after the market closes. Can you describe the object? That's what I did. Describe the object. Now it turns out that there are 4 objects which I've never seen, and they are related mathematically randomly to 4 possible market states.
They are assigned independently by someone else.
That's right. I don't know what the objects are, and I don't know what they've been assigned to. Or anything. Now I say I'm going to be handed an object on Monday, and say there's a banana in the pool of objects, and I describe a yellow curved thing. It's kind of squishy and reminds me of apes. Okay. And they say, well, you know, the banana seems to fit that a little bit, and it's the only one that does. Then they pick it up and they say, oh, look, that's the one that we would show Keith on Monday if the market went up more than a quarter. So the only way he'd see that is if the market went up more than a quarter. And now we told him to describe what he was going to see on Monday. And he said he was going to see the banana. The only way he'd see that is this, so the market must be going up. So on Friday we'd call the broker after doing this on Thursday from Monday's close, and we would go into the market based on that prediction. None of it was done mathematically in the sense of knowing what the market was. It was done only with randomness, assigning different objects to certain
And this
conditions.
is the technique that you use 9 times in a row with success.
Actually, if you want to know the truth, it was 13 times in a row.
Uh-huh.
There were a number of pilots, and then there was another experiment after that.
I see.
But the actual December silver series was 9, and those were correct.
So this is potentially a technique that commodities, stockbrokers, people who invest or trade could do with themselves or with their friends and associates.
If they don't get too greedy and too analytical and put the pressure on and really turn it up, and people tend to limit themselves, and they tend to, in that situation, it has a very peculiar way of tricking them. What they'll do is they'll occasionally describe accurately the wrong object in the pool. So now they could not have known what was in the pool,
Yes.
and they accurately describe some other thing.
It's what we call displacement.
That's right. And of course, if you displace in that way, and you think the market's going down when it's going up, I hope that you put your stops in at the right point.
In other words, there's something in the subconscious that is getting the accurate information, but deliberately, at the subconscious level, causing the displacement to occur.
Yes, and I think it has to do with the interpersonal dynamics of the people involved and whether they really want to go ahead with it. And everybody will say, well, of course I want to go ahead with it. Are you kidding? But
We're talking about the deep integrity of the individuals in relationship to all of this. Because it would seem to me that if we're using psychic abilities, if you can use them to predict the future, as in effect you are, that what they might also be useful for is looking deep inside of ourselves and looking at our own goals, our own direction, and our own purpose.
Of course, that's the most important application of all.
Yeah.
And before we get off too much on talking about money and markets and all, there are a lot of really straightforward needs out there that don't involve moving cash around in the way we're talking about. It involves finding some lost kid, or
Healing.
Healing needs a lot of research, but potentially looking for a missing airplane,
Medical diagnosis.
looking for natural resources. I mean, there are tons of
Almost any area of human activity might stand to benefit from this added tool.
looking for a parking place,
Or an apartment in Berkeley.
or a girlfriend or a boyfriend. You know, the thing is that in some of those situations, it's so spontaneous, it's so sort of everyday life that you'll never be sure if that's psychic or if you're just lucky or what the heck's going on there. On the other hand, if you find a parking place in San Francisco, that's not even psychic, that's a miracle. So you don't really care how you got it.
Well, where would you really like to take this in the future?
I would like to take this into understanding ourselves better. In fact, I've put together a new institute with some people called the Institute for Advanced Psychology. And we really need to integrate this kind of research into the mainstream of modern science and to understand what that tells us about what it means to be human and about what we're doing here and how we can relate to one another in a more positive way. I realize that that sounds very idealistic, but we really have a very poor understanding of human nature right now, and it gets us in a lot of trouble.
How about specifically what would you do? How does that translate?
Well, I'm interested in myself in doing more research in remote viewing, seeing how the extent to which that's available to people in general, and seeing how we can make this more and more reliable and accurate and useful in everyday life. There are other areas that don't have to do with psychic research, which are also important for understanding human nature: communication, perception research, animal-human communication, work on prenatal psychology. All of that could have input into our understanding of human nature, and also, in an interdisciplinary kind of way, work with psychic research and with other areas to really help improve our understanding of each area separately and then all of them together.
So in a sense, you might say that the thrust of your work is to take away the para from paranormal so that these phenomena might be integrated into the mainstream of our lives.
Absolutely. I never would call myself a parapsychologist unless I were jumping out of an airplane. The idea is that what we're doing here is scientific research, and we need to look at that in a clear-headed, scientific way to understand what's going on without imposing our own beliefs on it, and put that together with other areas, other fields of research, and begin to get an interdisciplinary handle on more of human nature. I would like to make this normal, but it's not me that's going to make it normal. It is normal, but I would like people to realize that it's normal, and to take the films like Carrie and Scanners and all of the psychic aliens from Mr. Spock to
the Omen, the demons,
the visitors, to just say, okay, that's fun for television and the movies, but don't get the idea that that's what it's really like.
You've been involved in this field very deeply for 15 or 20 years or more. Have you ever encountered these sorts of things?
Psychic aliens? No. No, I haven't. I've encountered a lot of people who are so disturbed by the images that they see in the media of psychic abilities that they believe themselves to be aliens because they feel alienated from other people as a result of it. But
you spent quite a bit of time counseling these people, didn't you?
A huge amount of time, and some of those people, I'm afraid, wind up in cults because the cults promise them answers that they don't really have, because nobody has them, but they promise them a whole world view for a little information about psychic abilities.
And yet you yourself have experienced almost the complete range of known abilities. For example, you're, I might mention, one of the foremost research subjects in the area of out-of-body experience.
Yes, well, there's the fellow who had the out-of-body experience and was beside himself, but that wasn't me. I'm sorry.
But that's exactly the point. You didn't lose your perspective. And I think what you're saying is one needn't join a cult or become a mystic simply by virtue of having these experiences.
If you do that, then whoever gets interested in this area pulls themselves out of society at large, goes off into a corner, and contemplates their own navel and has no impact on anything. And how can you expect to reach anybody and make this a normal field of inquiry if you yourself act like a deviant? You know, you can't do this research in a vacuum, and you can't pull it out of the mainstream because we'll never understand it that way. And I wouldn't blame people who looked at that kind of approach and said, look, that's too weird for me. Sure. If you act as though it's weird, then it becomes weird. It is not weird. It is just normal human ability.
Well, Keith, you seem to be an individual who in your life has really been able to demonstrate that. Your approach is very matter-of-fact. It seems very solid, and I gather that you find that it's being recognized by other scientists, by people in mainstream activities. It's been a great pleasure having you with me on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Book 2 in the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book series is a tribute to parapsychologist Russell Targ celebrating his 90th birthday.